So what is the NEBOSH NG2 Practical Project? Well, it's the second assessment if you want to pass your NEBOSH General Certificate. It's also known as IG2 if you're doing the international version of the certificate. So what is it? Well, it's hard. That's what I can tell you. It's hard. And the pass rate for NG2 and IG2 is actually lower than it is for the exam. People freak out about the exam. No, you should freak out about your NG2 and IG2 project. So what is it? Well, it's a risk assessment and a report. And you do this risk assessment usually on your own workplace or part of your workplace. And if you don't have a workplace, or if your workplace is not suitable, although to be fair, most workplaces are pretty suitable for it, to be fair. Right? There aren't many workplaces where you can't do an NG2 project. But if you don't have a workplace, or you don't want to do it on your workplace, you can use a different workplace. You could use the workplace of a family member, or a friend, or an ex-colleague. Just make sure you ask permission. And remember that the project can be anonymous, as in you don't have to give the company's name on the project. You can, like this one here, this one, if we look at the NEBOSH sample here, it says National General Garage Limited. I mean, that sounds like a fake name, doesn't it? So if you're struggling to get permission to do this, just say, listen, I'll put a fake name on the project and hopefully they will let you do it. I once knew one person who did their NG2 project on their local corner shop. They just popped in, asked the question, and they were like, yeah, whatever, as long as you buy some alcohol and cigarettes, you crack on. Now this project is marked by NEBOSH, and at the current time of filming, it is a pass or fail type result, which means there is no score. It is graded by NEBOSH, and the examiner has to mark it against a number of criteria, and it has to meet all of the criteria. Here we've got a list of all of the criteria at time of filming, and you can see with this one it's met, but there we have a not met, which means that this particular project failed. You can see it says refer at the bottom. Refer is just a posh word for saying fail. Now, if you're finding this video useful, please remember that Compassa, we are a GOLD NEBOSH Learning Partner. And if you did want to do your NEBOSH course with us, or if you needed some other NEBOSH resources or some future courses, you will find all of the links to those in the description below. Come to our website and see how we can help you. Now, as you can see on this document here, we have different parts to the NEBOSH NG2 project. We have part 1, part 2, 3, and 4. So it comes in 4 parts. And part 1 is kind of like an introduction where we describe the organization. Part 2 is a risk assessment, and that's probably the biggest part of the NG2 project. Part 3 is where we select 3 actions for improvement, and then we have to justify why we think we should do those actions. And again, we have to meet certain criteria in that justification. Part 4 is a very small bit at the end where we talk about how we're going to review the risk assessment in future, how we're going to communicate it, and how we're going to check that the actions have been completed. Let's take a look at the official NEBOSH sample here by NEBOSH. Now, this is an official sample. It is not a perfect sample. It's actually got some errors in it, which is nice because it shows you that you don't actually need to do a perfect piece of work. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to meet the criteria, even though you might have some spelling mistakes, some grammatical errors, or even some technical mistakes here and there. So here we've got the background. The background is where we have some kind of description of the workplace. So we've got the name, the location, how many people there are, a description of the organization, description of the area that you are risk assessing, because you might not be risk assessing the entire organization. You might be risk assessing just a small part of it, just one office or a workshop, maybe the roof of the building if you've got aircon units and water tanks, things like that. Then we have what I would call the methodology. So it's how did you carry out the risk assessments? And so here you put your sources of information, who you spoke to, and how you identified the hazards. Now it's worth noting that for part 1, at the current time of filming at least, part 1 is not a critical section. It used to be a critical section when this thing first launched, but it isn't anymore, which means that it is extremely difficult to fail your NG2 when you make a mistake in this part 1 section. That doesn't mean you don't have to fill it in. Please fill it in, but you can fail for part 2 in the risk assessment. Let's take a look at that. Here we have the biggest section of the whole project. We have a risk assessment form, which follows the 5 steps to risk assessment. We don't have any scoring systems. We don't have any risk matrices. We just had to identify a number of hazards and hazard categories across a broad variety of different types of hazards. And we have to fill in the form to the standard required, which means that it has to be what we call suitable and sufficient. Your risk assessment has to bring you into legal compliance. It has to be enough to reduce the risk to as low a level as possible. And you have to fill in the form properly, which means you have to have timescales, you have to have job owners, you have to use the hierarchy of control pretty well. And if we scroll down this, you can see that this is the biggest part of it. It's quite a lot of work here. There's about 10 pages on the NEBOSH version here. But I've known some students do 10, 15, 20 pages sometimes, which is probably far too much. About 10 pages is probably about right. Going on to part 3. Again, part 3 is a critical part of the NG2 project. If you make a critical mistake in part 3, you can fail the entire thing, which is obviously frustrating, costs you money, and costs you time. Now here we're going to spend a little bit of time justifying all of the actions using some moral, legal and financial arguments. That's quite a short section in total. But then we have to choose 3 actions. Notice here we've got action 1, action 2 and action 3. So we have to fill in a form for 3 actions. So you choose what you think are the 3 top priority actions. The examiner shouldn't be quibbling really very much your choice. What they're focused on is your justification. How good are you at persuading the reader to take action? So here we have to say what the action is, and it's worth noting that that action has to come from the risk assessment. So it has to come from somewhere in here. Word for word, you copy one of these actions, just one. It could be this one here, for example. You copy that and you choose that as one of your actions. So you would take that and put it in that box there. You then have to use some what we call specific legal arguments. And so you will look at a specific regulation, if there is one available. Here we've used the work at height regulations, and explain why those regulations might be being breached at the moment. Then we go on to talk about how likely and how severe the risk is if we do not act on this. So we talk about how likely it is, how bad it could be if it went wrong. In the course of that discussion, we talk about the types of injury, talk about how many people there are, how often we do the task, and how widespread the risk is. Is it in the whole organization or just one small part of the organization? And finally, you would mention how effective the action is going to be. So the action you've put at the top up here, like what impact do you think that's going to have? Is that going to eliminate the risk, just control the risk? What will it do in practice? Well, here, it will stop people from jumping over the pit. That's what they're trying to stop. They want people to use a bridge to cross the inspection pit. We have to mention a timescale. We have to say whether we think it's going to fully control the risk by itself or whether we need some other actions as well. You have to fill in that form to the satisfaction of the examiner. And not just that one, but we have 2 more as well. So we have 3 actions, so 3 forms. Any mistakes in there that are critical mistakes will lead to your NG2 or IG2 practical project failing. But then we get to part 4, which is the final bit, very small bit right at the very end. And this is currently a non-critical section, although when it first launched, it was a critical section, but that has now changed. Here, it's very, very difficult to fail for this section. So it's not an optional section, but don't stress too much about this. Make sure your focus is on part 2 and part 3. Now you'll have noticed, as I've shown you this, that we have some word counts. Now these are suggested word counts. Look, the word there, suggested word count, which means it is not a strict word limit. It's just there to give you some idea of what's expected. So it's like you're gonna have to write round about this much really to do a good enough job. You can write less, you can write more, and you will not be penalized if you write more. But if you write a lot less, chances are you haven't quite explained yourself. So don't stress too much about the word count, but put the effort in. So what happens if you fail? Well, the cool thing with the NG2 practical project is that you will get some feedback from NEBOSH and the examiner, and they'll tell you what criteria you didn't meet, and they'll tell you why. So all students get this, although it's only really useful if you failed. It'll tell you which of the criteria you failed, which would be this one here, likelihood and severity considered for each action. And if we scroll down, we'll see some feedback. And here we've got part 3. It's going to tell us what happened. And it says, well, here we did not indicate the number of engineers. Ah, right, okay, so that is the one thing, very small thing actually. It's a very, very small thing which is preventing this particular student from passing. So what do we do? Well, unfortunately, we would have to register for a future submission. That is going to cost you some money because you have to pay a new registration fee, and you're going to have to wait until that submission window opens. And the submission windows are usually on a monthly basis, depending on your course provider's calendar. Here at Compassa, we do our submissions every single month following the NEBOSH calendar. And it usually opens on the first Wednesday of each month, and the window to submit is usually about 10 days, 10 or 11 days or so. So you're gonna have to wait until that window opens, then you're gonna have to submit, and then wait 8 to 10 weeks for you to get your results. So failing is gonna cost you money, it's gonna cost you time, and it's going to cost you some frustration as well. But the cool thing is, you don't have to redo the whole thing. All you have to do is tweak your NG2 so that you meet that one criteria or several criteria which you didn't meet. So in this particular student's case, it sounds like it was a very, very small error. They're just going to have to enter in that number of engineers. For example, you want to update this review date here so that it's 12 months from now. And you've also, right at the start of the risk assessment, you've got a date here as well, date of the assessment. Update that so the risk assessment is, up to date, because risk assessments should be up to date. And then you resubmit it. And hopefully, as long as you've corrected that one issue to the satisfaction of the examiner will just look at that one issue, hopefully, and woof, you should pass. There is no need to change anything else. If you have any questions at all about how this NEBOSH NG2 or IG2 practical project work in practice, please drop them to me in the links below. And if you need any help with this, please check out the links in the descriptions, because we have a full NG2 and IG2 exam technique guide giving full detailed instructions on how to pass this. And if you follow those instructions properly and honestly, you will pass. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind there. If you fail to follow the instructions though, I'm afraid that will be on you. Anyway, best of luck with your projects, and I'll see you in the comments section below.